Dear students, let us continue our study of explosives, and in the last module we have studied what are explosives, what are the various types and some common examples. Now in this module we shall focus on the explosion process and the effects. After studying this module, you shall be able to be aware about the explosion process, the details how this takes place and the types of explosions, explosion effects and also their effect on living things. If we talk about explosion process, when a reactive material is heated, its exothermic decomposition happens. The heat may further increase the reaction rate and finally lead to deflagration, that is a self-sustained reaction. A rapidly travelling shock wave can also provide the initial source of heat in the reaction. A rapidly travelling shock wave can also provide the initial source of heat in the material. Under certain conditions of initiation and confinement, the deflagrating reaction can transit to a supersonic but a steady rate of reaction, otherwise known as detonation. In deflagration mode, the reacted materials get separated from the unreacted material. The detonation products flow with great velocity towards the undetonated explosive. A shock front or zone propagates at a characteristic velocity into the unreacted explosive at very high pressures and temperature. Behind the shock front, that is in the chemical reaction zone, the original material is rapidly converted into reaction products. The width of the shock front and the reaction zone could be as low as a few millimeters. It depends on the nature of the explosive material as well as on the boundary conditions. The temperature and pressure in the detonation zone could exceed several 100,000 atmospheres and almost 3000 degrees centigrade. Let us try to see what are the various types of explosion. An explosion can happen in many forms, and there are 4 different types of explosion, that is mechanical, chemical, nuclear and electrical. So with this background, let us continue the study with the help of graphics and visuals. Let us now go into more details and try to understand what are the various types of explosions. An explosion can happen in many forms, and if we talk about the different types of explosion, they can be categorized into mechanical explosion, chemical explosion, nuclear explosion or electrical explosion. The names clearly are indicating what type of explosions they are, but let us go into more details, because as forensic scientists you must know how these different types of explosions differ from each other. So beginning with mechanical explosion, a gradual build up in pressure until that pressure overcomes the conflict of the containment vessel, causing a mechanical rupture, is an indication of mechanical explosion. It is basically the failure of a containing vessel as a result of internal pressure in the excess of the structural capabilities of the vessel. And you have to keep in mind that in mechanical explosion, the nature of fuel does not change. If we talk about boiling liquid expanding vapor explosion, which is abbreviated as BLEVE, this is an example of mechanical explosion such as fire in a gas cylinder, like even LPG at home. When you are having this gas and if it is exploding, then it is the internal pressure which is making the outside vessel just rupture. So, this is a case of mechanical rupture. Similarly, it can happen in a tank or rail cars that are carrying liquids. So, mechanical explosion actually is having a mechanical rupture. And similarly, you can talk about the pressure cooker bombs and so on. There also you will find the mechanical explosion happening. Coming to chemical explosion. As the name suggests, here it is due to the chemicals which are reacting and then the explosion is happening. Rapid conversion of solid, liquid or gas into gases with much greater volume than the substances from which they were generated, and due to some chemical reaction, then it will be a case of a chemical explosion. In chemical explosion, the nature of fuel changes. Recall that in mechanical explosion, the nature of fuel is not changing. So, whatever was inside the LPG, it is the same gas which remains. But here in chemical explosion, the initial substances are something else, and when they are combining or reacting, then they are going into gaseous form and also their nature is changing. So, that is very important thing that you have to keep in mind. And the reason being, it is burnt and consumed during the transformation or the explosion process. And if we talk about the examples of chemical explosions, initiation of low explosives or high explosives and the fuel air explosions, they all come under the category of chemical explosives. And if we try to name the chemicals responsible, you can have the TNT, nitroglycerin, RDX, they are all chemical explosives. Moving to the nuclear explosions, another type of explosion. A nuclear explosion, as the name suggests, is because of the nuclear reaction happening. And when we talk about the nuclear reaction, it is the nucleus, the atom is undergoing reaction at its nucleus either by fission, that is the bigger nuclei are breaking and giving you small atoms, which is the nuclear fission case, or you can have the small atoms joining through the process of nuclear fusion. And in both of them, there is a large or tremendous amount of heat which is released and it is there as an explosion. In nuclear explosion, not only the energy and heat, but even large amount of gases are released. The release of energy, heat and gases in nuclear explosion is much more than the chemical explosion. And this is again indicative or a clue enough that yes, you can easily differentiate between a chemical explosion and nuclear explosion. But when you go to the nuclear explosion site, because of the radiations around, you have to be cautious and you have to take proper precautions to handle these. Furthermore, if we talk about the nature of fuel, yes, here also the nature of fuel will be changing in nuclear. So, as compared to mechanical there was no change in fuel nature, the gas inside it is just coming out because of high pressure and then breaking the surrounding vessel. But the chemical composition of the inside material still remain same after the explosion. In chemical, their nature changes, and in nuclear also the nature changes because of the reactions taking place. The fourth type of explosion, it is the electrical explosion. An electrical explosion, again the name is clearly indicating, has to do something with the electricity. So, an electrical explosion is a result of a high energy electrical arc which generates sufficient heat to cause the failure of the containing component such as an electrical wire. And if we talk about another type of electrical explosion, results not from the failure of a component but from the differences in the electrical potential, for example lightning. When electrical energy is transmitted through air, an exceptional amount of heat, light and noise is created. So, this will be an indication that yes, there has been an electrical explosion, due to which the explosion you have found at the scene. In electrical explosion also, there is no change in the substance, there is no chemical reaction which is happening. After knowing the types of explosions, let us try to see the explosion effects. There are various physical effects depending on the type of explosion, that is whether it is mechanical or it is chemical or it is nuclear or it is electrical. Severity of effect depends on a number of factors such as the type of explosion, the amount of energy or the amount of fuel present, weather conditions which are there and other factors. When an explosive material explodes or detonates, the chemical reaction still continues, it goes on, and this creates 4 types of effects, namely the blast pressure, thermal, fragmentation and ancillary. And let us discuss all of them one by one. These are very important terms as forensic scientists you should be familiar with. Talking about the blast pressure, it can be positive or negative. When we talk about positive blast pressure is the first effect which follows an explosion or detonation of an explosive. When an explosive charge explodes or there is a failure of the containment vessel following a deflagrating low explosive in a pipe bomb, the expanding product which are gaseous, they push on the surrounding air, and this produces and forces out a shock wave. The larger the explosive charge, the higher is the peak shock pressure at any given distance from the charge. Similarly, the farther away the charge, the weaker is the shock front. Positive pressure is extremely short in duration and usually lies about in the range of microseconds or millionths of a second. Talking about the negative blast pressure, after the energy generated in the positive pressure phase of an explosion expands, the longer lasting, lower velocity negative blast pressure phase begins. So, you can say that when the explosion or the detonation has happened, the initial very high pressure created is the positive blast pressure, and after that when it has subsided somewhat and then it still continues, that is what is the negative blast pressure. So, the negative blast pressure is longer lasting as compared to the positive blast pressure. After the blast pressure, let us look at the fragmentation happening. Fragmentation is basically seen in cases of missiles. They result from an explosion and may be a part of the explosive casing, container, earth, building material, target area or other items affected by the explosion. It may be sub-assemblies or fragments of the apparatus or the constructions or the complete items. Fragmentation effect of an explosion does not depend on the exploding explosive or bomb. Fragmentation can and does result from accidental explosions of other materials such as gas, dust and mechanical assemblies. After the blast pressure, let us understand what is meant by fragmentation. As the name suggests, fragmentation means it will just break apart, and the fragmentation results from an explosion and may be a part of the explosive casing, that is the outside casing, container in which the explosive material is there, earth, the building material may entirely fragment, the target area or other items affected by the explosion. So, they are moving, that is what is the fragmentation. And it may be sub-assemblies or fragments or the fragments of the apparatus or construction or complete items. So, you can understand it like that initially the explosion is happening because of other thing, but then whatever materials are there around it which may be of metal or glass or other strong material, they are breaking apart and they also act and add to the effect of explosion. So, that is what is meant by fragmentation. Fragmentation effect of an explosion does not depend on the explosive or the bomb. So, it is the surrounding things which are contributing to the fragmentation effect. Fragmentation can and does result from accidental explosions of other materials such as gas, dust or mechanical assemblies. Now, let us move to thermal explosion. If you look at the name, it is thermal. Thermal means heat. So, basically the incendiary or the thermal effect is the heat produced from the explosion or decomposition of an energetic material. The temperatures from this reaction and burning process, depending upon the type of explosive, can reach or even exceed 7000 degree Fahrenheit, and that is a tremendous amount of heat. And this is very fast and there is a short duration of the release of so much amount of heat, and that is why it is also called as a flash fire, that is immediately it will be flashed as fire. The target material and victims or people can be extensively burnt from the heat of the explosion due to the thermal effect. The burning depends upon how close they were to the explosion. Victims, when you go to such scene of explosion, you can easily identify by looking at the victims, because victims may even have a blackened effect on their skin. You will find their skin has become black. The hair you will find has been partially burnt off or merely just saying. So, these are the indications that is thermal effect is the effect which is due to the heat produced from the explosion. So, it is again you can see it is not the directly material or the chemicals of that, but the heat which is being produced because of that explosion happening. Coming to the ancillary explosion. Ancillary explosion includes a number of direct and indirect effects from the initiation of an explosive. Ancillary effects are also known as secondary blast pressure. And there are many types of ancillary explosions, of which reflection and earth and water shock effects we have to understand, and let us take them one by one. First, taking the reflection part. Reflection, as the name suggests, it is the bounced or rebound explosion pressure. So, reflection effect will be the bounce or rebound explosion pressure wave which has forced on a hard or mediative surface, that is the intermediate surface. On the other hand, when we talk about earth and water shock, as the ground and water are denser than air, the explosion shock wave can travel longer distance and faster than the shock front in the air. And if we talk about the examples of water shock, in the terrorist bombing of the USS Cole in Aden or Yemen, Navy divers searching the ocean floor for bomb components, they discovered a huge crater in the ocean floor directly beneath the site of explosion, and this was due to the water shock. So, after understanding these different types, let us try to understand the effect on living things, that is how explosions will be having effect on the living things. People close or in the vicinity of the blast incident are obviously very prone to get affected. Usually, if we talk about which types of individuals are used to get more affected, people wearing little or no protection, which is very usual because not every time we will be wearing. The bomb disposal technicians also, because there may be some bomb which is still live when the bomb disposal team reaches there, so they also can be impacted. And even soldiers wearing body armor or deminas, they also can get the impact because they will be going close to these bombs very often, and yes, it can explode. The effects on live things which are near to a blast instance can be categorized into 4 types, and they are heat, impact, fragmentation and overpressure. And overpressure is also called as shock. When we talk about what is overpressure, overpressure or shock is the abrupt and extreme upsurge in ambient pressure which can harm the internal tissue, probably leading to everlasting harm and in most cases death. Coming to fragmentation. Fragmentation includes the shrapnel. It also includes debris, soil, vegetation from the site covering the blast source, which is very common in anti-personnel mine blasts. The prognosis of element contains a theoretical fatal threat produced by wounds in soft tissues, contaminations and damages to the internal tissue. So, it will be just making even the body rupture and fragment, and that is why the damage inside. Coming to the impact, when the overpressure wave collides with the body, it can cause low levels of blast induced acceleration. Resultant injuries, they vary from insignificant to unsurvivable. Immediately preceding this initial acceleration, deceleration injuries can take place when a person collides directly against a hard surface or hindrance after being stable in motion by the force of the detonation. Talking about the effects of heat, wound and casualty can result from the explosive fireball as well as the inflammable means projected onto the form. Personal protective instruments like a bomb suit or helmets, collaborative visors and foot protection can effectively diminish the special effects depending upon the charge, proximity and other variables. So, what we can say is, when you are visiting a crime scene to investigate, and that too of an explosion kind, then you should take proper care of first protecting yourself and then investigating the. So, you should keep in mind all these, and looking at the victims and the area around, you can easily identify that which type of explosion it has happened or gone through, that is whether it is the mechanical or the chemical. Nuclear will be very less in common. So, when you go to an explosion site, after going through all these details, you will be now more knowledgeable whether that explosion is a mechanical explosion or it is the electrical explosion or it is the chemical explosion. Nuclear explosions will not be very common, but then you will be able to identify by knowing all the parameters that we have discussed in this module. Let us now summarize what we have learnt in this module. We have learned that when a reactive material is heated, its exothermic decomposition happens. In deflagration mode, the reacted material gets separated from the unreacted material. The detonation products flow with great velocity towards the undetonated explosive. The temperature and pressure in the detonation zone could exceed several 100,000 atmosphere and around 3000 degrees centigrade. An explosion we have studied can be mechanical, chemical, nuclear and electrical. You also studied the BLEVE, that is the boiling liquid expanding vapor explosion. It is an example of mechanical explosion. Rapid conversion of solid, liquid or gases into gases with much greater volume than the substance from which they were generated is the characteristic of chemical explosion. Initiation of low explosives, high explosives and fuel air explosives are the common examples of chemical explosives. A nuclear explosion is stimulated by either fission or by fusion, and we have studied that in nuclear explosion there is a tremendous release of energy, heat and gases. The release of energy, heat and gases in nuclear explosion is much more than the chemical explosion. The nature of fuel changes in nuclear and chemical explosion, whereas remains unchanged in mechanical explosions. So, these things you should keep in mind. We also studied that there are various physical effects depending on the type of explosion, whether it is mechanical, chemical, nuclear or electrical. Severity of explosion effect depends on type of explosion, amount of the energy, amount of the fuel, weather conditions and others. When an explosive material explodes or detonates, the chemical reaction goes on, and we studied there are 4 types of explosion effects are blast pressure, positive or negative they can be. Another one is thermal, then fragmentation and ancillary. Positive blast pressure is the first effect which follows an explosion or detonation of an explosive. Fragmentation results from an explosion and may be a part of the explosive, casing, container, earth, building material, target area and other items affected by the explosion. Fragmentation can and does result from accidental explosions of other material such as gas, dust and mechanical assemblies. We also studied that thermal effect is also known as flash fire. Victims of thermal effect may have a blackened effect on their skin and hair can be partially burned off or merely sink. So, these are the clues that will help you in the investigation. Ancillary effects we studied are also known as secondary blast pressure, and ancillary explosions they include reflections and earth and water shock effects. Then we also studied that people wearing little or no protection, bomb disposable, technicians, soldiers wearing body armor or demirs are prone to get affected from ancillary effects. The effects on living things which are adjacent to an explosion episode are overpressure, disintegration, impression and heat. We also studied that overpressure can damage the interior structures, probably leading to everlasting harm, and death. Fragmentation is very common in anti-personnel mine explosions. So, dear students, all this information is going to help you a lot when you become forensic scientists.